Well, once again, I'm glad to be back with you, continuing this series called Ruth. Um, Redemption, the story of Ruth. I don't know if you have seen the Liberty Mutual commercial. It's one of those commercials that's really good. You'll probably remember it, but you'll be like, oh, I didn't even know that's who the commercial was. It's one person who sees another person do a kind act. They do the kind act, and then they are put in a situation, and then they do a kind act, and it just continues to go. One person sees one person do a kind act, and their response is to be kind to someone else. There's something about kindness. There's something about kindness when you see it, it does something to you. When it's done to you, it has an impact. But even if you see someone be kind, to go above and beyond what's normal or typical, it does something to you. I can think about my own life and just a couple of things, even just recently. We have a young girl in our church who works at a nursing home. It just so happens to work at the nursing home of Joe, who is an older man who's a part of this church. He was having some issues with laundry, and so I went to go pick it up and do it for him. And he was like, Sarah already took my laundry. This is Sarah who works for the company, who works for this nursing home, who went above and beyond. She doesn't even know Joe. She's kind of newer to the church and isn't here all the time, but showed this kindness to Joe. This unexpected, undeserved kindness. Think about my mom. If you are on Facebook, my mom drove 8 hours, got here yesterday morning about 9:30 or 10, was here for a couple hours to watch my daughter's ballet and left, and we surprised my daughter. And I had a hidden camera. I couldn't miss that opportunity. But man, my daughter, just the feeling she had, the love she experienced as she sees my mom walk through the door and yells out Mimi and begins to cry. There's something about the kindness of other people. Even kind of in a silly way, I had some deer sausage that went bad, right? This is really silly. And I sent a message out to a few guys, and I'm like, I don't know if I should eat this. It doesn't look right. And so I just sent a message to a few guys. I was like, could you tell me? And one guy was like, just cut the bad stuff off and eat the rest. And I'm like, I'm not sure about that. And then last night, one of these guys hand-delivered deer sausage onto my doorstep. Right? It seems silly, but like just this unexpected kindness of people. It does something to us. Now, we are going to be in chapter 2 of Ruth. And kindness is going to be kind of this theme that runs through chapter 2. It's going to be this picture of God's kindness, and there's going to be a character in this part of the story that is going to really put that on display. We're going to look at this character named Boaz. Boaz is a man among men, okay? Like, if you've never read the story, many of you probably haven't, but Boaz is going to be kind of the rescuer of the story. Facebook has a group called Waiting for Your Boaz. And there's 300,000 people who like this page, right? Boaz is a well-known, romantic, loving, encouraging man. Like, I don't know if Ryan Gosling has nothing on him, Channing Tatum, Liam Hemsworth. Those guys are nothing, okay, compared to Boaz and who he is. But see, Boaz is going to be more than just a character in this story. Boaz is actually going to be pointing or drawing a picture of who God is. Right, so we can really, as we read this and we think about Boaz, we really have an opportunity to think about who God is. And so some of you weren't here the first 2 weeks. Last week we paused as I was gone, and I'm thankful for Justin filling in for me while I was away. But we're gonna pick back up, and so I just want to give you a real quick rundown, just in case this story's new to you or you were gone those first 2 weeks. We have a lady named Naomi who's married to Elimelech, and they live in this place called Bethlehem. Bethlehem means the house of bread. They have 2 boys, and there becomes a point where there is no bread in the house of bread. There's this famine that has hit. And so in the midst of the famine, Elimelech decides to leave. And he leaves the promised land. He leaves the area where God has always provided, where God has always come through. But for some reason, Elimelech begins to doubt. He begins to question, and he's got his boys, and he's got his wife, and he thinks, I need to leave this place so I can provide for my children and my wife. And so they leave, and they go about 40 miles to Moab. Now, the interesting thing about where he goes is the Moabites and the Israelites do not like each other. They have a history, you could say. The Moabites have not been good to the Israelites. They've been oppressing them. They've done wrong to them. They've hurt them in many ways. And so Elimelech decides to leave his people, his setting, where God's presence has been with them, and decides to go into the land of Moab. Now, it's not long after Elimelech's there that he dies. And now he's left Naomi, a widow, with 2 boys. Naomi in those times is a widow. You don't have anything. Widows were kind of the lowest of lows, that they were kind of forgotten. They didn't own property. They didn't really matter much. And so this is where Naomi finds herself. Then the two boys end up marrying Moabite women, which would have not really been permissible. If Elimelech would have been there, I wonder if he would have said, no, we're not going to do this. We'll wait till we get back. But love is love. And so these two boys marry Moabite women, and then they die. And so now you have Naomi, and you have Orpah, one of the women, and Ruth, now all widows. And Naomi is a foreigner, so you have widows who are at the bottom of the totem pole, you have orphans, and you have foreigners. And now Naomi can check the box on two of those. And she has no one, and she has nothing. But she hears that the famine is over back home. And I wonder if for Naomi, if she ever got to a point where she was like, this isn't really what I expected my life to look like. She thinks, man, I really thought things were going to go different. I mean, Elimelech, we had a great love story. We had two great boys, and things were going well. How did I find myself here? You ever thought that? Have you ever looked at your life and thought, man, this isn't what I planned? I thought it would look much different. That's where Naomi finds herself, but she hears. Somehow word has got through to her that Bethlehem, there's now something good that is going on, and so she begins to make her way back home. And so she tells Orpah and Ruth, you need to stay here. Don't go back with me. I'm not going to be able to provide a son for you. We'll never be able to provide grandchildren. This isn't going to happen. And so you guys need to stay here. And so Orpah says, okay. And then Ruth says, there's no way. And one of the most beautiful, greatest verses in this whole story is verse 116. And this is the point where we see that something has happened in Ruth's life, in her heart. And she tells Naomi, her mother-in-law, look, where you go, I'm going. Your people are going to be my people, and your God is going to be my God. Now, here's what's been going on. Ruth comes from a place where there's lots of gods. You kind of do whatever you want, and you have your people, and it really doesn't matter how you live life. But something's changed in Ruth's heart, and she says, look, the God that I've heard you talk about, that I heard your son talk about, and even in your midst of doubting, you would still speak about him, I'm now following that God. I want to be with those people who follow that God. I want to be with him. And so nothing but death will separate me. And so they make their way back into Bethlehem. But in the midst of that, Naomi has believed that God has afflicted her, that God has had it out for her. And so when they get back into Bethlehem, the women begin to see Naomi and they begin to speak to one another like, wait, isn't that Naomi? Like, she looks different. She's lost a little weight. She cut her hair. She's aged a lot over the 10 plus years. Is that Naomi? And Naomi hears them speaking about her, and Naomi says, wait, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. My life is far from pleasant right now. Don't call me Naomi. If you call me Naomi, I won't listen. Call me Mara, which means bitter. God has had it out for me. He's afflicted me, and so because of that, there's this bitterness that I have, and so don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. And then, chapter 1, where we left off, there's this glimmer of hope. There's this glimmer of hope, and it's a small line in the story, but it says when they come back, it's the time of harvest. Right? We know they've been in famine, but now this harvest is about to take place. So even though she's been in a place of famine and then she loses everything, she comes back in a great time of hope. And so this is the overarching theme of this that I want you to connect with and to know, and this is where we're going to be like every week, is this idea that no matter what you've done, no matter the decisions that you made, no matter the decisions that has been made on your behalf, no matter what's been done to you, no matter where you find yourself today, it doesn't mean that you don't have hope for your future. It doesn't mean that tomorrow or next week or next year that things couldn't look different, no matter where you find yourself right now. It doesn't matter if you've run from God. Like some of you maybe run from God and you have found yourself back in this place today. Or maybe, and I know this happens a lot, the people that you look to who called themselves followers of Jesus hurt you. Why would you want anything to do with it? I get that. So again, no matter what has happened to you, no matter where you find yourself today, there is hope, I believe, for you and for us. And so we're going to jump into chapter 2. Hopefully we're going to get through this whole chapter today. I'll touch on a few themes that we'll dive deeper into next week. If you don't own a Bible, there should be a red Bible around you. That's our gift to you. You can have that. I would encourage you, write in your Bible, highlight, circle, write notes. There's going to be some things maybe you want to remember down the road. So Ruth chapter 2, it'll also be on the screen. Sorry I don't have that page number in there for you. That's my mistake. So here we go. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. So from the very beginning, the author introduces in chapter 2 this man named Boaz. Enter the knight in shining armor. Right? What we don't see in this is the importance of him being from the clan of Elimelech. This is like an extended family. He knows the father-in-law of Ruth. And not only does he know him, but he's connected to him. Not only is he a part of the clan of Elimelech, but he also is a man of standing, which means he has wealth, he has power, he has strength. He's well known there in Bethlehem. This is not just any guy. This is a man who has been set apart by God. Verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. Now, again, when we read the Bible, there's often these moments where we don't really understand what's happening. It's different than the culture that we're in. And so what is happening? Well, the Mosaic law, the law of Moses, so the Old Testament part, the culture of Jewish tradition would say, if you had a field, don't take everything for yourself. The corners of the field, leave those. And leave those so the poor can come behind you and have food and have the resources that they need. This is one of those parts of the scriptures that's proof that God cares for the poor. Cares for the poor. He has a heart for the poor. He wants to provide and be generous to the poor. And the way he does that is through people. And so this isn't uncommon. This isn't weird that Ruth is asking to do this. She has at some point heard that this was Jewish tradition. Remember, she's not a Jewish woman, but she has heard that this is what is supposed to be going on. And we know who she is. She's a poor widow woman. And so she thinks there's got to be someone out there who I could find favor with, that is actually following the teaching of Jesus, right? Because we know just because it's in the scriptures, just because it's tradition, didn't mean people were following it. We see that today, right? We see that today as we follow Jesus and confess to follow Jesus, and we know what God says is good and right, but doesn't mean that we always follow it. But Ruth believes. Ruth believes that she's going to find someone out there who is actually following the teaching of God. She has this bold faith. Right? She has this bold faith that people are actually going to be doing what God has asked them to do. And I wonder if this is because she has this new faith. Right? Have you thought about this? Like, this new faith, when people begin to follow Jesus, they actually believe the teachings of Jesus. They actually have this boldness that says, if God said it, God is going to do it. And unfortunately, at some point for many of us, if we've walked with God very long, sometimes our hearts become hardened to that. We've seen God not come through how we wanted him to. And so we begin to question and we begin to wonder, but not Ruth. Not Ruth, not this poor widow woman. She believes that someone is going to help her. I don't know where you're at in your faith. I don't know if you've reached a point where you would say, God's going to come through for me. I don't know if you've gotten to a point where you've said, I just don't know anymore. I just don't know anymore. But for Ruth, she believes it. And so Ruth does. She goes out. Verse 3. So she went out and began to glean in the field. So she went and she began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. As it just turned out, as luck would have it, just by coincidence, Ruth happens to be in the field of Boaz. This is where we can see God's provision. That God provides. That God knew where Ruth was at in life and has given her opportunity to find favor, to find the resources that she needs. But this is what I want to share. God won't make us do anything. Right? And so for Ruth, For Ruth, she has this idea that if she was to go into the field, she's heard the teaching from somewhere. She has this idea that people are going to leave the edges of the field. But Ruth doesn't just stay there. Ruth doesn't just stay at home with Naomi thinking someone will bring something to me. She takes a step. She takes a step of faith and says, if I can just get in the field, if I just get in the field, maybe I'll find someone who will show me favor. So we have this free will. We have this choice to choose and make good decisions of what our life will look like. And so Ruth responds. And she goes. It just happens to be in the field of Boaz. Verse 4. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, whose young woman is that? So Boaz just happens to show up while Ruth is there. And his address to the people says a lot about Boaz. This takes place in the time of what's called Judges. So if you were to go back one book in the Bible from where you're at right now, it ends saying there's no king in the land. No one recognizes any king, and everyone does as they desire. Not Boaz. Not Boaz. Boaz seems to be a guy who's held on to his faith, who is greeting his people with these words of affirmation. The Lord bless you. And then verse 5, he says, whose young woman is that? It's like this slow motion scene I get in my mind, right? He's talking to his harvesters, and then like off in the distance, he sees this young woman who pulls her hair down and shakes it out, and the son's behind Ruth, right? You get the picture, and he like stops, right, and sees her and says, whose woman is that? Now, understand this. He doesn't say, who is that? He doesn't say, who is that? And this is why, because everyone at that time belonged to somebody. They were a part of something. And so he's like, who does she belong to? Whose is she? Verse 6, the foreman replied, she is a Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. The writer here gives very clear emphasis to who she is and how she comes from the wrong place. She's not one of us. Boaz, she's not from here. She's a foreigner. She really doesn't even belong here. Verse 8. So Boaz said to Ruth, and just pause for a second. In my mind, Ruth is off in the distance. And so when it says here that Boaz says to Ruth, I don't think Boaz just begins to yell at Ruth. And I think this is really important. I think it's really important. Boaz doesn't send someone else to bring Ruth to him. Boaz leaves where he is and goes to Ruth. This is super important. I'll get to this in a minute, but this is a very important part of the gospel, the good news of Jesus. Boaz leaves where he is and makes his way to Ruth. My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in any other field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. So he goes to her and says, look, don't just pick at the edges. I want you to be with my servant girls who I've hired. You stick with them. Pick from the good stuff. And not only that, don't go anywhere else because nothing's going to happen to you here. So Boaz is not only providing for Ruth, but he's also saying, look, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to protect you during this time. And then the last part, whenever you're thirsty, just tell the guys. Now, another one of those points where like, okay, no big deal, but it's huge. In that time, there's no way a man would serve a woman. Right? In that time, the women would be the ones going and filling the jars. And the women would bring that to the men to drink. And there is no way that an Israelite would serve a foreigner. So now you have Boaz flipping the script. He says, I know who you are. I know where you've been. I'm changing all of that. When you're thirsty, you tell my men, and they'll bring you water. They will provide for you. You will not go thirsty. Ruth responds, verse 10. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground and she exclaimed, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me a foreigner? I'm nobody. Why would you show kindness towards me? Why are you caring for me? And in this moment, Ruth begins to, in a way, worship Boaz. Verse 11, Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. We just sang about it. And the interesting thing here for Boaz is Boaz doesn't just like stay in the limelight and say, yeah, everything's about me. What does Boaz quickly do? Well, hold on. Let's give credit where credit is due. This is God. This is the Lord who is being faithful to you. May he richly reward you. And may you understand that you are under the wings of the one who will give you refuge, the one you can trust, the one who will be faithful to you, the one who will protect you. Verse 13, may I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls. Again, I'm nobody. But even though I'm nobody, thank you for caring for me and protecting me. Verse 14, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. All right, here's where it changes. All right, here's where the good stuff begins to happen. Here's where Boaz and Ruth have their first date. All right. Now, I'm not saying it's like Facebook official at this point. It's not. They're not having a relationship defining talk at this point. That's not happening. But this is a first date for Ruth and Boaz. I was thinking about my first date with my wife. We had went to homecoming together, and I've shared some stories about how she turned me down often for a while, and finally gave in and gave me a chance. But our first date, we went to this place called Otto's Burgers in Kansas City. If this tells you anything, it's not around anymore. And so I took her to Otto's, and we had dinner, and then I took her down into where the fountains are in Kansas City, and we walked around, and it's pretty hilly, and I realized pretty quickly that Heather was struggling walking the hills, and she then informed me she had worked out that day, getting that last minute tone and wanting to look nice for me. And so it was quite the first date. And luckily it was good enough that we've now been married for 15 years. But now we joke about it, right? We joke about it. And she's like, I really thought you would have taken me somewhere nicer than Otto's. And I'm like, sorry about that. I was trying to go comfortable. But it was a decent first date. This is an incredible first date. I don't think we understand the magnitude of this first date, that Boaz invites Ruth in, that he feeds her, and not only does she get all she wants, but there's a leftover container that she's going to be able to take with her. Verse 15, as she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Feel the kindness and the love here. Even if she gathers among the sheaves, the rows in the middle, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. Verse 17, so Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not a measurement that I often use. An ephah, all right? This is about 30 pounds. This is about 30 pounds of barley. The average male for a day's work would get 1 to 2 pounds. And she ends up, at the end of the day, with 30 pounds of barley. Verse 18. She carried it back to town, which says a lot about Ruth. And her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Okay, so let's look back at Naomi real quick. Naomi has been in these moments of bitterness, of suffering, of turmoil, of questioning her faith. Is God going to come through for me? Is God going to provide? And then she sees Ruth coming, right? Get this picture. Ruth is carrying this 30-pound bag of barley and throws it down. And Naomi's like, where have you been working? Where did you get all this? And then Ruth, as if it's not enough, she pulls out her leftovers, right? And says, there's more. God has taken care of us. Verse 19, her mother-in-law asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. Another one of those slow motion moments, because as soon as she says Boaz, Naomi understands everything. She understands everything. Verse 20, the Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. I don't have enough time to give that credit, and so we're going to talk more about that next week. But this is really, really important that she calls Boaz, this kinsman redeemer. But this idea for Naomi, in the midst of some of the worst times of her life, she says, look, he, God, has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. He has not quit being faithful to us. He has not forgotten about us. Verse 21, then Ruth the Moabitess said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. To be continued. There's been so much that's happened, and then the last line is, well, she spent the next 2 months harvesting the field, and she lived with Naomi. There's nothing else right there. There's nothing more about, well, what happened with her and Boaz. It's like the screen goes black and the words to be continued come up. And next week we find out what begins to happen with Boaz and Ruth. But chapter 2, what is it for us? Just quickly. What can we take away in this? 2 things. One is Boaz is going to display the gospel, which I led to a minute ago. And number 2, Boaz is going to paint a clear picture on how followers of Jesus are supposed to love people. All right, so quickly. We don't see God directly mentioned here as we read through this. Right, there's no mention of God. However, there is this display of God's character through Boaz through this whole part. If you want to know what God is like, you can look at Boaz. Now, Boaz is just a man. He's not perfect by any means, but the characteristics of Boaz give us a glimpse of who God is. A heart for the poor, care for the widow, to care for the foreigner, the forgotten, the outcast. In the midst of brokenness, that Ruth and Naomi see the beauty of who God is. It's in the midst of their brokenness and despair and worry and fear and anxiety that they see who God is because of Boaz. And for us, for you, I know in my own life, there's been moments in my brokenness, there's been moments in my pain, there's been moments of fear and my anxiety where it's hard for me to see who God is. And I doubt, and I question, and that's what's been going on. And then enters Boaz. See, sometimes we can't see the goodness of who God is in the midst of those things. We can't see it. But it doesn't mean that he's not active. It doesn't mean that his presence isn't with us. That he pursues us. Just as Boaz leaves his place and goes to Ruth, God has done that on our behalf. That God didn't create and walk away and say good luck. That God sends his son Jesus into our presence. And the only reason you or I can love God is because he has first loved us. Now, you might find this hard to believe, the idea that God loves you, but he does. No matter where you've been or what you've done, he has a deep care and concern for you. A deep love for you. Who are we? Who are we that he should care for us? Who am I that he should have concern towards me? I'm a child of his. I'm one who was created by him in his image. Listen to this scripture, Ephesians 1, 7 and 8. It says, in him we have redemption through the blood, the forgiveness of sins in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he lavished. It's abounding. It's exceedingly more than we could imagine. that he has lavished on us with all wisdom and understanding. The comparison of what the average man gets, the 1 pound of barley, and Ruth carrying 30 pounds. Exceedingly more than you expected. The grace for you is exceedingly more than you could ever imagine. What you've done, what you will do, fail in comparison to his grace and his love. And so the question is, do you receive that? Have you thought about God's kindness towards you? Have you recognized your need for it? And have you accepted that in your life? That's between you and God. An opportunity for you to say, all right, God, I need that. I want that for my life. And then the second thing is Boaz paints this picture for the church. See, God has designed us, the church, his people, to put on display the radical ways of his love. That's your job. If you are a follower of Jesus, if you call yourself a Christian, it is your responsibility. You have been designed to put on display the radical love of God, the radical care for the other, for our neighbor, the widow, the orphan, the foreigner. But if we translate that into our culture today, that could look lots of different ways. Who is that for you? Who is the one you see as an outsider, as an outcast? Who is the one who you feel like you could never show care or concern towards? What would it look like for you to love them and to love them well? So you have to ask yourself, is your life a visible demonstration of the love of God, who loves everyone and cares deeply for every person? See, ultimately, it doesn't matter what we say or what we sing. Right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we say or what we sing, but it's how we live those things out. You cannot separate what you say you believe and how you live. We can't do that. And so it's this opportunity, and we see this in Boaz. The character of God is coming through in the life of Boaz, not by his words, but by his actions. So 2 questions from chapter 2. Have you experienced and accepted the kindness and grace that only God can extend? And are you putting the display of that kindness into your everyday lives? We've been ending a little different lately. Greg's going to come up and lead us in a benediction, a blessing. And we've been singing this. And the words to this are extremely important to your walk and to my walk with God. The idea that what we've talked about, let us put these things into practice. Let us not be a group of people who are just hearers of the word, but we would be doers of the word. Father, thank you for your exceedingly, more than I could even imagine, favor in my life. The grace that you have given me, the mercy that you have extended to me when I could never repay it, I don't deserve it, it's not something I can earn, but yet you've come to me. You love me. And so God, would you help me to be a visible picture of that? Would you help us as a church? I pray for my friends who are here today who have never accepted that kindness, that love, that they've never admitted their need for it. That we're sinners, that we're broken, and we need the grace that only you can give. I pray for them today and pray that today would be a moment where they make that decision. And then for the rest of us, would you encourage us to be visible demonstrations? That when people would see our lives, they get a glimpse of who you are and your kindness. I pray this all in Jesus' name.